Chapter 4 The Fight is Won. Thankfully, Basil had not been shot. Instead, the impact of the fall knocked the wind out of him. His inability to get air into his lungs caused him to panic. Basil had never even thought about the process of breathing. It was simply something that his body accomplished on its own. But now that he could not coax his lungs to function, it seemed that breathing was all he could think about. And the harder he tried to suck air into his lungs, the more panicked he became. Basil rolled awkwardly onto his back, hoping that the change of position might help him breathe. He was becoming frantic. He looked all around for someone to help him, but it seemed that everyone was too busy shooting, running, or hiding. The yard was full of confusion, fire, blood, and death. Basil wanted to cry, but first he had to find his breath. He thought, "Calm down, Basil. You have the wind knocked out of you before. Just relax. Stop thinking about it. The air will come." Basil closed his eyes and attempted to calm his spirit. He intentionally avoided all efforts to breathe. Instead, he counted slowly to 10, put his lips together, and attempted to blow every bit of air out of his lungs. When he reached the number 10, he slowly, deliberately, and calmly began to breathe in. It worked! Refreshing cool air poured through the mouth and nose and quickly filled his wind-starved lungs. Basil lay flat on his back in the grass, closed his eyes, and relished the life-giving air. Somehow he managed to tune out all of the gunfire and screaming that surrounded him. He thought, "I'm done fighting. I will lie here and play dead until it is all over." The shrill scream of a woman echoed to Basil's left, drawing him back from his solitude. It was his mother. He scanned in the direction of the scream. He gasped when he saw his mother at the edge of the tree line. One of the invading militiamen held the helpless woman by the hair of her head. He was using her as a shield against gunfire as he made his retreat into the woods. There was a flash of movement as a horse approached from Basil's right. He recognized the rider. It was his brother Henry, charging full speed toward their mother and her captor. Henry held a cocked pistol in his hand. Basil watched helplessly as the man holding his mother brought his own pistol to bear on Henry. The man's gun barked, and immediately the galloping horse and Henry Billingsley tumbled haphazardly to the ground, throwing up a cloud of sod and dust. Basil heard another scream. It too was a familiar voice. Across the lawn he spotted his older brother, Walter, running toward his mother and her captor. Walter had a pistol in his hand. He was aiming the gun and preparing to fire. Walter had only taken 3 steps when something stopped him mid-run. The boy spun slightly to his left and then collapsed onto the dusty ground. He did not move. Basil screamed, "Walter, no!" He tried to roll over onto his knees. He had to help his brother, but his pain-ravaged body was still slow in responding. The violent fall from the horse had left him bruised and sore. Suddenly, unexpectedly, there were no more gunshots. Basil glanced around the yard. A haze of gunpowder smoke hovered in the air. The enemy soldiers were all gone. Samuel was kneeling beside their mother. James was tending to Walter. John and the workers from the farm were trying to extract Henry from beneath his dead horse. The poor animal lay across the lower part of his body, crushing his legs and pinning them to the ground. Henry screamed in pain. Basil slowly climbed to his feet. He scanned his front yard. The lifeless bodies of 7 enemy soldiers lay sprawled upon the lawn. Then he noticed something peculiar about the big oak tree that stood outside his bedchamber window. There was something hanging in it. There was a person hanging in it. Basil's heart sank when he saw who it was. It was his papa, James Billingsley Sr., hanging by the neck from a rope. His kind, loving papa was dead, murdered by the men who had invaded his home during the night. Basil was a brave boy. He had run over a mile in the frightening darkness of the night to fetch his brothers. He had ridden bareback on a galloping horse to return home and his parents, brother, and sister. He had even carried a gun into battle and fired a shot at one of the men who had attacked his home. Yes, Basil Billingsley was a very brave boy, but he was still just a boy. He was a broken-hearted, confused, and frightened 9-year-old. His father was dead, his brothers were injured. His mother was screaming and crying. He did not know what to do. So he sat down on the cold ground, crossed his legs, buried his hands in his face, and cried. Once he had enjoyed a good cry, Basil wanted something purposeful to do. He needed to stay busy and keep his mind off of the horrible things he had just seen and experienced. He first attempted to help Walter, who had been wounded. The boy suffered a large gash on the scalp where an attacker's bullet had grazed his skull. He had been unconscious for several minutes. Basil hovered near the body of his wounded brother, attempting to awaken him, but it seemed that all he was really doing was getting in the way of the grown-ups. James politely shooed his little brother away, urging him to go and find something else to do. Basil was heartbroken, but he obeyed his big brother. At long last, he received a worthy task to perform. Samuel placed Basil in charge of their mother's care. Elizabeth Billingsley was in very bad shape. She was physically and emotionally injured. Basil simply hugged her for a while. Actually, they embraced one another. Basil could not be sure who enjoyed the hugs more, him or his mother. But eventually, he encouraged her to follow him inside the house. Basil seated her in a rocking chair beside the fireplace and stoked the coals from the previous evening's fire. Soon, his sister Martha came and helped attend to her mother's needs as well. Amazingly, with Walter's help, Martha had managed to escape from the invading soldiers and hide in the woods. Once the battle was over, she returned to the safety of her home. She suffered several scratches and bruises while running through the dark forest, but was otherwise uninjured. Minutes later, the local doctor arrived at the Billingsley home. Martha helped the physician clean and bandage her mother's cuts and scrapes. She helped her mother put on a clean nightgown and then brushed her hair. Basil busied himself by preparing his mother's bed and brewing her some hot tea. All the while, the dazed woman never spoke or responded to their actions. She simply sat and stared numbly at the flames of the fireplace. Basil could not imagine the pain that filled his mother's heart. He knew that his own heart was shattered by his father's violent death. The boy watched tearfully when his brothers cut the rope and carefully lowered his father's body from the tree. He could not imagine the loss that his mother felt. His parents had been together for over 30 years. They had spent their entire lifetimes together. How would she ever be able to continue on and live her life without him? As he stirred a spoonful of sugar into his mother's teacup, Basil shook his head in anger and disgust. Large, heavy teardrops flowed down his cheeks. He could not imagine why anyone would wish to hurt his beloved, kindly father. Basil felt bitter and vengeful and confused. He wanted to understand why all of this had happened to his family. Basil carried the fresh tea into his mother's bedchamber. He arrived in the room just as Martha was tucking her mother into her soft feather bed. Suddenly, a shrill cry carried across the front lawn. It was the voice of Gabrielle Tate, one of the farm workers and Walter Billingsley's best friend. Gabrielle excitedly exclaimed, "Walter is awake! He is all right! Come and see!" Basil glanced pleadingly at his sister. He desperately wanted to go and check on the well-being of his brother, and he wanted answers. He wanted to know why his home had been attacked and why these horrible things had happened to his family. Martha smiled. "Go ahead, little brother. I will help Mama with her tea and then sit with her until she goes to sleep. I will come and see Walter as soon as I can." Basil grinned thankfully. He quickly sat the cup on his mother's nightstand, kissed his sister on the cheek, and then sprinted out of the house. He ran to the spot where Walter still lay on the ground. The boy was surrounded by all of his older brothers. Basil broke through the circle and fell upon Walter, covering him with a barrage of squeals and hugs. "Slow down there, Basil," urged Samuel. Walter's been slugged. A bullet bounced off of his skull." The eldest Billingsley brother peeled Basil off of his wounded sibling. The four siblings knelt in a brotherly circle of protection and care. Gabrielle Tate hovered over Samuel's left shoulder. "What happened to those men who killed Papa?" Walter asked bluntly. "Tory hooligans," Samuel corrected him. "Bushwhackers and robbers loyal to King George." He spat on the ground. I know who and what they are, Sam. Now tell me, what happened to them? 7 of them won't see another sunrise, commented John. Another 5 or 6 stole away into the woods. We found the horses of the dead tied off in a small cove about 200 yards to the west. Walter nodded slightly. There were 13 total, as best I could tell. Their captain and another dozen men. Samuel nodded. That's what we calculated. Did you get their captain? Hissed Walter. James responded, I don't think so. The dead men all look like ordinary fellows. From the looks of their clothes, they were all farmers, and poor ones at that. Which one was their captain? The one that had Mama by the hair of her head, responded Walter, his lip quivering. Oh, so he was the one that shot Henry's horse, mumbled Samuel. Walter nodded slightly. Will Henry be all right? I saw him fall. Samuel smiled. He'll be fine. Doc says he might carry a limp for the rest of his days, but he will still be able to swing an axe and a hoe. James commented, Walter, I saw you going after Mama. You were running, pistol in hand, and then I saw you lurch and go down hard. I assumed that the fellow who had Mama was the one who shot you. Walter shook his head slowly. No, he had just gotten off a shot at Henry, so his powder was spent. I was too afraid to shoot. He was holding Mama right up against him. I was making a move to his left and trying to get closer when I felt a loud thump on my head. The next thing I knew, Gabe was dangling over me and chattering a mile a minute. The Billingsley brothers chuckled lightly. Gabrielle Tate feigned a look of offense. Where did you get the pistol? Inquired Samuel. Walter remained silent for a moment and then answered, off of the man that I killed, the one over the steps. The men in the circle glanced knowingly at one another. I saw you taking cover behind the body when I arrived, commented James. I was wondering what had happened. You killed him with your bare hands, didn't you? Walter nodded. He responded just above a mumble, his words choked by emotion. I'm so very sorry that I couldn't save Papa. His lips quivered as more tears welled in his eyes. There were too many of them, Walter. What more could you have done? Encouraged James. I don't know. His body shook slightly. He paused and glanced toward the hanging tree. His voice became somewhat frantic. Where's Papa? Who took him? We cut him down, Walter, James assured him, placing his hand on his brother's shoulder. Papa is being cared for. Some of the ladies from the church are cleaning him up proper so that we can have a service for him tomorrow. Walter nodded, his face displaying relief. Basil could remain silent no longer. He pleaded, But why did they do this, Walter? Why did these men come after us? Why did they hang Papa? Walter stared empty-eyed at his little brother. He reached up and rubbed the hair on Basil's head. It is complicated, Basil. I am not certain that you would understand. I am not stupid, Walter. I know more than you think I do. Now tell me, Basil demanded. Walter glanced at his older brothers. They said he was guilty of treason against the king. That doesn't make any sense, exclaimed Samuel. Papa's not involved in politics or the legislature. How could he commit treason against England? Walter explained their captain acted like a crazy man. He accused Papa of hiding weapons and terrorists in our house. Papa swore up and down that he was not a traitor. He told the men that he was most definitely not hiding weapons in our house. A few minutes later, one of the soldiers upstairs got all excited when he found my hunting gun. Grandpa's old bird gun? Asked John in disbelief. Walter nodded. Once they found the gun, the captain declared that Papa had lied to him. He said that Papa had lied to the king. He called him a traitor to the crown. He demanded that Papa surrender a fine of 100 pounds sterling in silver to pay for his so-called crimes. Gabrielle Tate whistled low under his breath. The Billingsley boys exhaled in disbelief. All of this was over an ancient bird gun? Growled James. Walter shook his head in disgust, ignoring the throbbing pain in his skull. No, it was more than that. I think the man intended to hang Papa all along. He was just looking for an excuse, replied Walter. Did he hurt you, Walter? Basil asked innocently. Walter smiled reassuringly. I said a couple of unkind words to him. He clubbed me over the head with his pistol, but don't worry, I will be just fine. It's a good thing that your head is made of iron, teased Basil. Walter punched his little brother lightly in the arm. Well, they surely were not expecting you fellas to show up, declared Walter. They paid for that mistake, didn't they? Indeed they did, affirmed James. He paused and then patted Walter gently on the chest. That was good thinking, by the way, sending Basil out the window to alert the rest of us. He glanced at Basil. And I can't believe that you ran all that way in the middle of the night, little brother. Basil beamed with pride. James continued, I know that our papa is dead, and my heart is broken because of it. But the two of you likely saved both Mama and Martha. And Lord knows who else these men might have intended to attack, added John. It was a brave thing that you lads accomplished this night. Samuel nodded. Brave indeed. Who would ever thought that Walter and Basil would have been the first among us to fight in this war of revolution? An awkward silence hovered over the group. Gabriel Tate slapped Samuel on the back and inserted himself into the moment. Well, you Billingsley boys can hold hands and kiss later. How about we get Walter inside out of the cold and tend to him proper? Besides, it will be time for breakfast soon, and I'm famished. One of you fellas is going to have to do a wee bit of cooking. I like gravy with my biscuits. The Billingsley boys, despite the pain in their hearts, laughed at the ever-entertaining Gabe Tate. They helped Walter to his feet, hugged one another, and then walked around the back of the house toward the kitchen. As they journeyed toward a warm fire and the promise of hot food, young Basil prayed that a good meal and the fellowship of his brothers might help him forget about the horrible events of this dreadful night.